This afternoon we're going to be talking about a very important topic, diabetes. It's a rapidly escalating problem in America, largely because of the growing obesity epidemic. This is not just an adult problem anymore. This is a pediatric problem of major proportions, and this is very much connected with our last lecture on Thursday morning. Tonight, if you're going to miss any lectures, tonight's the lecture not to miss. It's my favorite lecture, and it's the one that we get most interest in. I just came back from Germany, and the people there, we couldn't keep them quiet. The questions went on for an hour regarding the topic tonight. So if you miss tonight, then you'll be very sorry. So this afternoon, we're talking, as you can see, well, is this not turned on, or? Okay, we'll go back to diabetes. As you can see, we're fine. We see that 11 million Americans have diabetes, and unfortunately many of them don't know it, and many of them have not been diagnosed. And this, of course, creates a problem because it needs to be managed. And what is diabetes caused by? It's caused by either a lack of insulin production from the pancreas, or it's caused by ineffective use of insulin by the body. And that comes about largely because of too much adipose tissue, and insulin is, the adipose cells are resistant to insulin, and there's a problem there. And what happens because of the ineffectiveness or the insufficient amount, we have elevated blood sugar. Insulin's purpose is to get glucose from the bloodstream into the cells. If you don't have enough insulin, or it's not working properly, then the glucose stays in the blood and doesn't go into the cells where it's metabolized for energy. So you have elevated blood sugar, and we call this hyperglycemia, or elevated blood sugar. And as you see here, diabetes is the seventh leading cause of death, with almost 40,000 deaths a year, so it's a major issue. Then of course there are complications with diabetes. Heart disease is more prominent, stroke is more common, kidney disease can result, blindness in the very final stages, and of course amputation of limbs can occur. So these are all very serious complications that none of us want to get involved with. And just to show you some of the data, you see here, people with diabetes are 2 to 4 times more likely to have coronary heart disease, and 2 to 6 times more likely to have a stroke. And 10% of diabetics develop end-stage kidney disease, where people will often end up having a transplant of the kidney or be on dialysis, and that dialysis can get progressively more intensive. Each year 5,000 people lose their sight because of diabetes. The blood supply to the back of the eye is altered because of changes in the blood vessels there. Diabetic eye disease is the #1 cause of new blindness in people aged 20 to 74. And diabetes causes about 45% of all non-traumatic leg and foot amputations in this country. So it's not a very pretty picture, is it? Diabetes is not something I wish upon anybody because of the complications. Now, is diabetes something that we inherit, or is it something that results from bad lifestyle or bad food choices or a lack of exercise, or is it all of the above? And the answer is yes. Genetic factors are definitely involved in both type 1 and type 2. Type 1 is more commonly seen in children, and it occurs precipitously. Type 2 is what we have referred to in the past as maturity onset diabetes, the diabetes that occurs as people age and as they get more and more overweight and the cells become resistant to the action of insulin. Then type 2 results. But also lifestyle factors are very much involved, and they can either delay or they can hasten the expression of diabetes. And we'll see the food choices and other lifestyle factors that can impact it. Certainly the biggest connection between diabetes and any lifestyle factor is that of obesity. The major cause of diabetes is being overweight. It's not from eating too much sugar as has been expressed in different places. You see here, overweight in American women is responsible for 90% of type 2 diabetes. 90%. And unfortunately, 2 out of every 3 Americans are overweight. And you can easily find out whether you are overweight by measuring your weight for height and looking at standard tables, or just doing what they call the educated pinch test. Undress, stand in the mirror and see how much flab you can find around the middle part. See if you're carrying a spare tire on the body instead of in the trunk of your car where it belongs. Okay? Here you see the increased risk of death for being overweight, and here it's 20 to 29% overweight, 30 to 39% overweight, and 40% or more overweight for men and for women. And here's the increased risk. These numbers here represent the increased risk of death from diabetes, from being overweight. And you can see, as you would expect, the risk increases the more overweight you become, or the more overweight you are. And the other thing that you notice is not only that being 40% or more overweight is 4-fold increased risk, but you see the effect is more pronounced in women than in men. In the case of women, 40% or more overweight, you have 7-fold increased risk of death from diabetes. So certainly if you want to avoid diabetes, losing weight or maintaining ideal body weight is a way to go. So just quickly, some basic principles, 7 guidelines I've written here for effective weight management. One of the basic principles is avoiding snacking, because if you do, you'll soon have to go to Walmart and buy bigger slacks. Avoid eating too much food or else your tummy will protrude. So it's basically don't overeat, don't eat snacks, don't overeat. And avoiding all the carbs that you know is certainly not the way to go. Some people think, well, if I just avoid carbs, I'm right, carbs elevate blood sugar stimulates insulin production. My hyperinsulin problem is because I'm eating too many carbs. On Thursday morning we'll address that in more detail. Beware of the high-fat meal. We learnt this morning the dangers of too much fat. And also we'll talk later about the Atkins diet. This is no deal. New resolutions you surely must make, and beware of all the cookies and cake. All the desserts are certainly something you want to watch out for because they're loaded with calories. High fiber meals are surely okay. Eating new habits must be here to stay. So eating lots of fiber-rich foods, a lot of water in the fiber-rich foods will give you satiety, and you'll have fullness without the extra calories, and you'll be less likely to be overweight. And the 7th principle is exercise, taking time for a daily walk. Make it fun, whatever you do, and stop all the talk. We're good at talking about what we're going to do. We need to just do it, right? That's what we learnt this morning. Let's just do it. Now, there's a big marketing promotion for eating low-fat and low-cal foods that we've talked about, and particularly as it comes to regulating body weight. And the thing that really is frustrating is that a low-fat or a low-calorie food is neither if you eat multiple servings of this. And we'll address this back when we come back to it in our topic on obesity. Now, when we think of diabetes, there are generally 3 goals that are shot for. Number 1 is to normalize a person's blood sugar levels. That's very important. You don't want elevated blood sugar levels. You want to normalize their blood lipids, their cholesterol and triglycerides, because most people with diabetes end up with heart disease, and that's often the killer of somebody with diabetes. And thirdly, you want to maintain optimal body weight. That's ultimately the goal, to regulate the other 2. High body weight is going to cause abnormal blood glucose and abnormal blood lipids. So getting the weight down is going to help in managing MNT stands for medical nutrition therapy. And the therapy usually involves an integrated approach. It involves proper nutrition, certain ratio of carbohydrate, fat and protein, or watching the calorie intake and so forth, exercise, and in some cases the use of drugs where diet and exercise doesn't achieve the desired regularization or amelioration of the abnormal blood lipid and blood glucose levels. It's interesting, a recent paper published showed that the typical sort of Western diet aggravates your risk of diabetes. There was a study of over 42,000 men consuming a prudent diet, and that was defined as one that was high in fruits and vegetables and fish and whole grains. They had a 16% reduced risk of type 2 diabetes when you compared the highest intake, the fifth quintile, versus the lowest quintile, while those that were consuming a Western type diet, which the authors described as lots of red meat, processed meat, fries, high-fat dairy products, refined grains, sweets and desserts, all the things you've learnt from New Start should be left for someone else, not for you, right? So those people who are eating that kind of typical Western diet, McDonald's sort of diet, they had a 59% higher risk. So eating the good foods, reduce the risk. Eating the bad foods, you have a higher risk. So eating the McDonald's foods is something that you want to avoid. You know what Garrison Keillor said about McDonald's? You know Garrison Keillor, the great storyteller of Lake Wobegon on public radio? Well, he said the more frequently you walk under the golden arches, the sooner you'll reach the pearly gates. Okay? You may not agree with the theology, but at least the sentiment behind it is certainly worth thinking about. Now, this morning we learned about saturated fat and the danger it has towards increasing your risk of heart disease by blood clot formation or elevated cholesterol. But you'll see we've added another thing here about saturated fat. It decreases the sensitivity of insulin, its effectiveness of it working. Trans fat, we learned it was bad also for reasons you see there, elevating your bad cholesterol and depressing your good cholesterol. But again, we've added another item here. It increases insulin resistance. Okay, so here are two other things you can say about the bad fats. They're not good for people who are wanting to avoid diabetes. On the other hand, mono, we learnt this morning, was a good fat, and it lowered your bad cholesterol and raised your good cholesterol. In addition, it allows the better control of triglycerides, which often on a low-fat, high-carb diet, it's often seen that triglycerides go up. The use of monounsaturated fat, as you saw with olives and avocado and nuts, those kind of foods, the use of those replacing some of the carbohydrate enables the triglyceride levels to be better managed. So people who are carbohydrate sensitive, then you're going to recommend that they eat those type of foods that are high in the monounsaturated fat at the expense of reducing some carbohydrate from the diet. And we want to recognize when we talk about carbohydrate that not all carbohydrates behave the same way. Some starches, for example, like bread and potato, are actually digested just as fast as sugar. I don't know if you realize that, but when you bake or boil a potato, the starch is gelatinized and is in such a state that it is easily digested, very easily digested. And bread, because it's ground in fine fashion, particularly white bread without the fiber, these are digested very quickly. And your blood glucose response to a food or to a meal is in direct proportion to how quickly the starch is digested. So things that digest quickly are going to cause rapid increases in blood glucose, which are going to be more of an insulin challenge to the body. On the other hand, people are often concerned about sugar, and you should avoid all forms of sugar and never use any table sugar. That's what some people think. But actually, for the person with diabetes, a little bit of sugar, less than 5% of your calories in the day, can be obtained from sugar. So there isn't necessarily the need to avoid all sugar, particularly if it's in the context of a high carbohydrate, a high fiber fruit and vegetable, well, particularly vegetable meal, rice and beans and some vegetables with a little bit of sugar in the form of a cake or a cookie once in a while isn't going to cause blood sugars to go way off. Okay, just keep that in mind. We've also seen that whole grains are protective against risk of diabetes. They did an experiment where 11 overweight adults with high blood levels of insulin were fed either whole grains or refined grains for 6 weeks. And what did they find? They found that those who were consuming the whole grains, their fasting insulin levels were 10% lower. And when they did a test where food was given and they measured the blood glucose response over a 2-hour period, they found that the response was 53% lower in those using the whole grains. What does all this mean? It means your blood glucose and your insulin responses are modified by using whole grains. So a person at risk of diabetes or a person with diabetes shouldn't be using refined cereals and refined breads. In the famous Nurses' Health Study in Boston, we'll mention this again tonight, but the one that we want to focus on particularly is this here, type 2 diabetes. For those who were consuming the highest amounts of whole grains compared to those consuming the lowest amount of whole grains, the risk is 38% low, almost 40% reduced risk from eating your whole grains compared to using refined grains. Here's another study that was recently published. Your risk for diabetes, this is for a high level of intake of whole grains, and it's been adjusted for other factors that we know are involved with diabetes. And here again in the red, it's adjusted for body weight. And you can see in both cases, there's about a 35 or 40% reduction in risk of diabetes from using your whole grains. So whole grains are certainly protective, and it's probably because of the polyphenolic antioxidants that are in the bran. These are fairly unique. We'll talk about them more tonight, but these are obviously very helpful in terms of protecting against diabetes. Now, I mentioned earlier that all starch is not created equal. So don't think that if you look up a book composition table to see how much carbohydrate it's there, it doesn't necessarily give you the whole picture. We talk about glycemic index, which is the response of eating foods to what your blood glucose is going, how the blood glucose will respond to eating different types of foods. And we want to avoid, particularly those at risk of diabetes and those with diabetes, they want to avoid too many foods that are high glycemic index. These are the ones that cause blood glucose to respond substantially. The ones that have a lower glycemic index are preferred. So your bread and potatoes are right up the top there with sugar. So you don't want to be eating a lot of bread and a lot of potatoes. Those that have a medium response are your vegetables, your rice, pasta, even the refined pasta, because of the way it's compacted, the way it's made, it's slower to digest. You see barley, carrots, honey, things that either have substantial fructose in this case, or in this case, the fiber that's there. Also, dairy has a medium GI, and the ones that have the lowest are your legumes, your beans and your lentils. The carbohydrates, the beans and lentils are not all protein, they have fat and they have carbohydrate. And the carbohydrate in the beans and the lentils is the very flattest blood glucose response. If you were to draw a picture, the high GI would give this kind of blood glucose response, and the low GI would give this kind of response. So the candy bars and the white bread are like the Colorado 14,000 peak mountains, you know. They're very exhilarating, but they're also very exhausting if you're bicycling through them, whereas the rolling plains of Iowa and Nebraska are easier to cycle on, and that's the kind of beans and lentils sort of response that you have. So here they've done a number of studies to compare different types of foods in different forms. You see the insulin response, which you want to keep low, okay? You don't want an elevated insulin response. So everything over here on the left is more favorable than what's on the right, because the things on the left have lower insulin responses, okay? So your home-cooked baked beans in the pot or in the oven or in the pressure cooker or however you do it are going to have a lower response than the commercial canned products. So, you know, Grandma was right. Home-baked stuff is better for you. It's slower to digest, and glucose is absorbed from the digesting carbohydrate, and the insulin response is less. Long grain rice is less than short grain rice, and it has to do with the type of starch. There's two types of starch, amylose and amylopectin, and the amylopectin is much more rapidly digested. Amylose is slower to digest. Long grain rice has more amylose in it. Okay, so the higher amylose means slower digestion, so flatter insulin response. So again, if you're wanting to control your blood sugar and insulin picture better, long grain rice with beans is right on. That's very good. Corn on the cob is better than corn flakes and corn chips. It's not just because of the fat, but it's the way the food is processed. Potato is better than instant potato. The same with rice. Whole grain rice is better than ground rice. So obviously cooked wheat berries for cereal is better than bread, because the bread has the wheat ground up, and so it's more quickly digested. Sourdough bread and pumpernickel bread are better than regular bread. It's been shown that these are slower digesting. And pickled cucumbers give a lower response than fresh cucumbers. It's just one of the anomalies. I'm not recommending we all go that direction. I'd rather the fresh cucumber, but this just gives it an overview. The dairy, even though it is fairly low on the glycemic index, you'll know it's very high on the insulin index. So that's kind of an anomaly there. Don't think that yogurt or milk, because of its low glycemic index, is necessarily good for diabetes, because it does have a substantially higher insulin response. Now, you'll notice here that a high fiber intake, particularly from cereal, is associated with a lower risk of diabetes. So fiber is very important, along with, if you eat low glycemic index foods along with fiber, that is the foods that don't produce a quick rapid response of blood glucose. And in this study you see that those who are eating a lot of bread and sugar and potatoes, and also their cereals without much fiber, they're at 2.5 times the risk of diabetes compared to those who are eating fiber-rich cereals and foods that have low glycemic index. So glycemic index is good. That's your rice and pasta and beans, rather than eating bread and potatoes all the time. Now we need to eat at least 25 grams of fiber a day, and of course if you're wanting to get more benefit from fiber, protecting against abnormalities in your blood sugar, you can even get a little more. Some have suggested up to 50 grams of fiber a day. The soluble fiber is particularly the best. And where do we find the soluble fiber? It's all the good foods, your beans, carrots, squash, apples, oranges, oats, barley, lentils. Any of these can provide you with substantial soluble fiber. And not only do they help in modifying your blood glucose and your insulin levels, but you see they're also good for bringing down your cholesterol levels. Soluble fiber, it's different than the insoluble fiber that you get in green beans and wheat bran and that kind of stuff. And fiber is always best when eaten in whole foods. You've learnt that, haven't you? In your New Start program, you want to minimize the amount of processed food. And the fiber in an apple is better than what's in an apple sauce, and that's better than what's in apple juice. The more refined you get, the more disrupted the fiber, the less valuable the fiber is in doing its work in protecting you. Dr. Anderson was one of the first. He's professor in University of Kentucky at Lexington. He was one of the first to show the great value in using fiber for diabetics. And here you see people who were fed high fiber diet for about 2 years. And these were lean diabetic men. Now, why did he choose lean? Because often when you go on a low-cal, high-fiber diet, you lose weight. When you lose weight, what happens? Your blood pressure drops, your blood lipids drop, your insulin drops, everything goes normal. That's the value of losing weight. So he didn't want to have the effect of fiber masked by losing weight. So he started off with lean people. And he found that after 2 years, approximately 2 years, some were a little less, some a little more, they found on average these are the results in the lean diabetic man. There were significant reductions in the insulin units that they were taking, or if they were taking drugs to lower their blood glucose levels. And in spite of the reduction in the medication that they were taking, their blood glucose levels dropped. You might have thought they went up if they cut back on their medication. There are some people who are able to cut out their medication altogether. These are the people who are marginal. The ones who have more severe forms of diabetes weren't able to do this, but those that have slight irregularities going on his program, they're oftentimes able to throw away their medication altogether. And in addition, the blood lipid picture improved. So this is very significant. Fiber is very valuable. Fruits and vegetables also help. Here you see the risk for diabetes, 5 or more servings a day compared to those who are eating nothing, basically nothing. And you see for women, it's about a 50% reduction. For men and women combined, it's about 30% reduction. So eating fruits and vegetables, whole grains, beans, and fiber-rich foods and foods with low glycemic index are all useful ways to go. Now, what about the mineral chromium? Chromium is found in whole grains, particularly in the bran, in the outer layers. It's also rich in many trace minerals, including chromium. And chromium has been shown to augment the action of insulin. Remember what we said insulin did? You have a cell, and the glucose is outside the cell in the blood, and you want to get the glucose out of the blood into the cell. And there are receptor sites on the cell membrane where insulin will lock into, okay? And then this will facilitate glucose passing in. Chromium facilitates the work of insulin at the membrane level to facilitate glucose getting in. And you see here, no, that's the next picture. Chromium is largely found in whole grains and brewer's yeast, and studies have shown that in elderly people living on a typical American diet of refined cereals, refined breads, refined grains, the chromium intake in their body, in their arteries, is extremely low. They did a supplementation test in China. They call it the Beijing study, where they gave Chinese either 200 micrograms or 1,000 micrograms of chromium supplements. The recommendation is somewhere around 200 or less, or they were given a placebo, which basically means a dummy, some sort of pill that's inactive. And they found that those who were getting the chromium supplements, their blood glucose and their blood pictures, their blood lipid picture, was normalized. What does that mean? They were probably chromium deficient, being given chromium supplements, their blood glucose abnormalities were normalized. So chromium seems to be very important for reducing the risk or ameliorating the symptoms of diabetes. We talked about beans earlier. Beans are also useful. A number of studies have shown they not only lower cholesterol and triglycerides, but they also lower your blood glucose level. So incorporating beans in the diet. Here's one study, an older study that came from Britain. Persons with diabetes were fed 300 grams of beans a day. That's quite a lot of beans, about 10 ounces. And you'll see both type 1 and type 2 patients had significant reductions in their blood glucose levels. Now, we mentioned earlier that being overweight was very much connected with running your risk of diabetes. And we learnt this morning that fat is high in calories, 9 calories per gram. And so a very effective way of reducing your risk of diabetes is to reduce your fat intake and thereby reducing your caloric intake, but must be combined with exercise. Exercise is extremely important. And when you look at the value of regular physical exercise, as we've listed here, you'll see that many of the effects are also achieved by eating a low-fat, high-fiber diet. Heart disease, diabetes, osteoporosis, hypertension, colon cancer, all of these things the risk of them is reduced by eating a low-fat, high-fiber vegetarian diet, and exercise will do the same. So they work together. A good diet and good exercise work together to help. Now, what kind of exercise should we engage in? Something that's very restrictive, something that gives you very strict delineated principles, or something that you enjoy? What are you going to stick at? Something you enjoy. And if you do it with somebody, you'll more likely stick at it, right? Mary and Jane walk together every morning at 6:30. Mary sleeps in one day and Jane's waiting, so she gets on her cell phone and says, "Hey Mary, where are you? Come on." What does Mary do? Answer the phone and listen and say, "Oh, shut up." Is that what she does? Of course not. They're friends, okay? They're buddies. There's commitment to one another. So just a minute, I'll get some clothes on and be right there. A week later, it's the reverse happens, and Jane's dragging the chain and needs a bit of encouragement from Mary. And that's the way it is in life, isn't it? If we work on something together, it's going to be more likely that the end result is going to be productive. So if we're walking, find somebody to walk with, spouse, friend, neighbor, whatever, okay? What does the American College of Sports Medicine recommend? They recommend to get the proper health benefits, we need regular, moderate intensity activity. Boy, that's good news, isn't it? I mean, we don't have to be training like Olympic champions, getting up at 4 o'clock and swimming 20 laps in the pool. Moderate intensity activity. And they recommend that we should get 30 minutes a day, and we can accumulate the 30 minutes. Boy, that's good news too, isn't it? We don't have to do all 30 minutes at one time. We can actually break it up into 10-minute segments. This is what the recommendation is. We want to do it on most days of the week. Well, what if there's a metre deep snow in your backyard and around the streets? What do you do then? You quit. You get in your car and you go to the mall, don't you? And you walk around the mall where there's no snow. So is that all that difficult? Doing 30 minutes a day, even in little short spurts? Okay? The idea of no pain, no gain, get rid of that. You don't have to kill yourself to get all the benefits. You can walk briskly, work up a pace over a time so you don't get out there and discover the first time a whole bunch of muscles you never knew you had before. That's not the way to do it. You do it gradually, just like when you introduce more fiber into your diet. So you feel better, your blood lipids and blood pressure will be reduced. You'll have better management of your body weight, and most importantly, in terms of the topic we're discussing now, you're going to have better control of your blood glucose. So walking's good. You don't have to buy any fancy clothes, do you? special Michael Jordan sneakers or a Tiger Woods t-shirt. You don't have to buy any of that. You can just go out as you are, and you can do it anywhere, at the beach, in the mountain, the sidewalk, and the risk of injury is very low. You're not going to be worried about getting a major injury from walking. And most people enjoy it. It's fun. It stimulates the endorphins in the brain, so you have an elevated feeling, which is very good. Now, there was an experiment done where they compared the effect of drugs and lifestyle, and 3,000 overweight middle-aged people with high blood sugar, but not diabetes yet, were given different treatments, and for 3 years they followed this treatment. One group got nothing, second group got a drug to lower their blood glucose, which is elevated, and the third group had counselling sessions about how to control their weight and what to eat, and also what exercises to engage in. After 3 years, you see here the number of people in each group that developed diabetes. Which group did the best? Those that followed lifestyle changes did better even than those that got drugs. And of course, those that got nothing were the worst off. They more likely went on to develop diabetes. Now, what about alternate sugars? Sometimes people want to cut down on sugar, but they don't want to get rid of the sweetness. Well, there are other things that one can use. There's fructose, there's the sugar alcohols, as we call them, sorbitol, mannitol, xylitol. Okay, what effect are these? Are these healthy? Are these responsible? Well, all of these sugar substitutes here have calories. We'll look at some in a minute that don't have any calories but are very sweet. People are more and more using those, but these are the older ones that people used in diabetic foods that have calories, but their effect on blood glucose is reduced. When you eat them, the blood glucose doesn't go up so high, and therefore the insulin need is lower. However, there's a little warning, and that is if you eat too much fructose, it can cause your blood triglycerides to peak, which you don't want. And it may have a laxative effect from using some of these sugar alcohols. We did an experiment at Andrews where we looked at preschool children that had diarrhea, where there was no fever associated with it, and we found a very good correlation between eating sugar-free candy and diarrhea in preschool children where there was no fever associated. The reason? These sugar alcohols have an osmotic effect in the bowel. They attract water because they aren't digested. They provide the sweetness, they aren't digested, they're poorly absorbed, they attract water and they cause diarrhea. And it's particularly pronounced in those who eat a lot of sugar-free candy. What about the artificial sweeteners that don't have calories? Saccharin, aspartame, acesulfame K, these things that are all been approved to be added to beverages and other foods. Well, their use by overweight people has not been shown to help in weight management. Why? Because people compensate. They don't get the calories. There's no calories in these things, so they eat other things to make up the calories they're missing. So they might as well go ahead and eat the regular sugar anyway. Here you see the three of them that I mentioned, and their sweetening power relative to sugar. You can see they're very, very intensely sweet. On a weight-for-weight basis, they're 200 to 300 times sweeter. And only aspartame has any caloric value. Saccharin and this other one, there's no calories associated with them. Aspartame is made from amino acids, and it does provide a few calories, but very, very little, because you're using 1/200th as much. Only a very small amount to give you the same amount of sweetness. Sucralose is a new one that's just come out in the last year or so. It is 600 times sweeter than sugar. Very intensely sweet. Provides no energy. It's a chlorinated sucrose. It's not well absorbed, and it's fairly heat stable, which makes it good for use in baking products. And it's been approved for almost 10 years now for desserts and tabletop sweeteners. So these are sort of things that people who want sweetness in their foods but don't want the calories or don't want the abnormal blood sugar effects can actually use. And then we have stevia, which comes from South America. It's a herb, and it has about 100 times the sweetening power that sucrose has, and it's fairly heat and acid stable and is used as a non-calorie sweetening agent for people who are wanting to manage their weight. And because of its non-calorie value, it can be used in the case of people with diabetes. Is it safe? We don't really know. We don't really know. Small amounts, it's okay. There's little data available. The FDA in this country and in the regulatory agents in Europe have not yet approved it fully, but it is used somewhat. We don't know what its long-term effects are or what its toxic effects are when used in large amounts. Pregnant and lactating women should not use it for that reason, and people who are allergic to compositae herbs or the daisy family should stay away from it also. Now lastly, we just want to talk briefly about some adjuncts that can be useful for people with diabetes. There are certain herbs that we can use, and we'll talk more about herbs, I think it's on Tuesday, but I just want to briefly mention some of the herbs that can actually help lower your blood glucose. There are a number, we'll list them here. Bitter melon is widely used in Asian populations in this country, also by the Caribbean people it's very commonly used. Fenugreek is more found in Asia, in the Indian population, as is gurmar, something we probably haven't heard of, but it's very common in Asian. Guar is a gum which is often used for weight management, and it does have an effect on lowering blood glucose. Prickly pear is common Hispanic. The fruits of prickly pear are very much loaded with soluble fiber, and that helps to lower your blood glucose. And ginseng has recently been shown to help a little bit. And then cinnamon is the latest herb or spice on the arena, and it has been shown quite nicely to lower blood glucose and blood lipid effects. This is not a very good picture of bitter melon. It's like a cucumber. Usually it comes about this long, about 10 inches long, but it does have these knobs on it, and it's been shown to lower blood glucose quite effectively. It seems to mimic insulin activity, and in clinical trials, the initial trials look rather promising for people with type 2 diabetes. Fenugreek, as I mentioned, is a legume that comes from, largely used in India, commonly used in curry formulations and so forth, and it has also been shown to improve glucose tolerance and reduce the insulin responses in diabetics. And 25 to 100 milligrams a day regular use seems to be beneficial. And then we have gurmar, which is this climbing vine, also from India, which seems to enhance the action of insulin. Ginseng, a recent study or a number of studies have shown that patients with type 2 diabetes that take ginseng can improve their fasting blood glucose and also their glycated hemoglobin levels, which are a measure of long-term glucose control. And then, as I mentioned, cinnamon was shown in a Pakistan study a few years ago. A number of researchers, particularly in the Maryland area, have been working with cinnamon and have shown that the sensitivity of insulin is greatly improved. It seems to affect the function of the insulin at the receptor site. There are flavonoids that are in the cinnamon, the actual class, chalcone, polymeric type material, which provides enhanced insulin activity. Here you see some of the others that have been suggested as providing some help. Flax, maybe because of its fiber content. Psyllium also because of its soluble fiber. Prickly pear, again, because of its soluble fiber. And chicory, because of the root. The root of chicory is very rich in inulin, and that seems to also help. So, in summary, weight management is the #1 issue. People who are overweight, we saw, have an elevated risk, and many of the diabetics today have resulted in that condition because of excessive body weight. The postprandial blood sugar levels, which means the blood sugar levels after we've eaten, they can be modified by the type of fat. You want to avoid saturated fat, avoid trans fat. You want to increase your mono fat, and it also can be modified by the carbohydrate that you ingest. You want to use low glycemic index, slow digesting, the pasta, the rice, rather than the bread and the potatoes. You want to eat foods that are rich in soluble fiber, lots of fruits, whole grains, vegetables, perhaps not so much the fruits as the vegetables. The vegetables are better. The fruits, of course, have natural sugar, which doesn't have quite the same effect as regular white sugar, but some diabetics do have difficulty handling too much fruit. Exercise is very essential. It helps the insulin work. It actually, studies have shown, increases the number of receptors on the cell membrane. So not only does it help insulin work, but it increases the number of receptor sites, the number of opportunities for insulin to work. So exercise and weight management are probably the two key things that you want to focus on, bringing your weight down and regular activity. There are alternative sweetening agents that are available. Some are better than others. The sugar alcohols can cause diarrhea. Your fructose, too much of that we saw elevates your triglycerides. The artificial sweetening agents, some of them have risk of causing cancer. The sucralose one that has just come out seems to be perhaps one of the better ones. And then, of course, there are certain herbs, spices like cinnamon, like prickly pear, like ginseng, like bitter melon, which seem to be useful adjuncts, but not things that a person with diabetes would rely on and throw away their medication. That's not what we're suggesting. We're suggesting that these things can be used to help reduce the level of medication, and your physician or healthcare provider should be aware that you are taking, or you should do it in consultation with your healthcare provider. In fact, we'll show this at a later lecture. You don't want to be taking any herb for any medical purpose unless your healthcare provider knows about it, because there can be interactions with drugs to accentuate or to minimize the effect of the drug. And so they don't know what's going on. This is strange, it's not working, or it's working abnormally. Well, if they get the total picture, then they can understand it. So use herbs with discretion. They can be useful.